I remember to do it. All right, good afternoon and welcome to Building with Blocks, implementing the WordPress Gutenberg editor. I am Mandy Morrow and I am the moderator and tech for this session. And I am just going to say that it is an honor to introduce Al Nemec, who's going to be talking about this. And I'm just going to let him introduce himself and take it away. We'll have a live Q&A at the end. So feel free to throw questions in the chat as we go through, and I will ask them of Al at the end.
Sounds good. Thanks, Mandy. I'm just going to jump right in here so we can get things started because I have a bunch of stuff I want to showcase, and maybe we can hopefully leave some time for Q&A because depending who's here and who's wanting to see some of this, you may have a bunch of questions, and it'd be great to be able to address some of those. So first and foremost, my name is Al Nemec. My title with TTC and what have you is Web Operations Manager over at Cal's IT. So we're over at Ag Hall there. If you've been up on the Henry Mall, you may have had a chance to be by there. Right now, they are conducting live earthquake drills, and by that I mean they're doing construction. So it's a nice thing that I can be remote today and not have to necessarily worry about rumbling the whole office while I'm trying to talk. So with that in mind, let's just jump into things. So today, I kind of wanted to go over Gutenberg in terms of a little bit more of a developer primer, but there will be some aspects of this that could be useful for folks that are just a little bit more content focused. So what are the things I'm going to be covering? Well, of course, I'm going to be talking about maybe why you want to consider using Gutenberg, who is using this on campus so far, at least that I know of. And I think if you are one of those folks that maybe isn't mentioned and you are using it, maybe mention that in chat. It'd be great to know. How to make your own blocks, which is kind of the bigger component to this whole thing. How to augment existing blocks, kind of a subset of that, and patterns as well, which I think are incredibly powerful. So things I won't be covering because this is a little bit more of a technical talk is going to be just the generals of what WordPress is and how to do just sort of broad page layouts. That'll be something that we can sort of see if there's some questions and answers that maybe you can answer later on down the road. So what is Gutenberg? Right now, Gutenberg is, of course, the code name for a new block editor that WordPress introduced back in 5.9. I think it was or earlier in 5, actually. 5.9 is just what they're up to now. It replaces the classic editor that if you've used WordPress for a long time, you kind of knew it was this just old classic, just big title area with a big old section, sort of like a text area that looked a little bit like a rudimentary notepad. Where you had some basic layout engine sort of things. And the nice thing about Gutenberg is it sort of has this mixed bag of being both more advanced, more capable, but at the same time, it has a little bit of a higher learning curve as well. So we're going to get into that. So the main thing is like, why did this come about? And I think for a lot of people, this is maybe pretty obvious, but of course, a lot of the other areas of the industry, you look at, other CMSs, especially vertically integrated ones like Squarespace or Wix or Weebly and things like that, started doing block editors, and those became somewhat popular because you can sort of modularize your interface and do a lot more advanced looking things. It was sort of almost this universal joke on the web that WordPress sites kind of all look the same, right? Because you could kind of only do linear content, and you could get around that in some ways, right? And some of those ways we are still around today. So and things that we've done, I know in Cal's in the past too, and things that some people have invested in buying third-party block editors as well for WordPress before even Gutenberg existed. But it was very much apparent that everyone wanted to be able to do a little bit more with their website than just a couple of paragraphs of text and that's it. So that's kind of where we got to today. Gutenberg is just WordPress's official implementation of having a block editor that's written in ReactJS. So why ReactJS? I think there's a little bit of this that's kind of interesting because I feel like it's a little bit of a reflection of the fact that a lot of the industry has said, hey, look at these cool new, dynamic and asynchronous JavaScript frameworks we have that do all these fancy things for us. And there are some really cool benefits to those. I do think it adds a little bit of complication to building them that takes a little bit of time to sort of get through and get used to. So I just want to keep that in mind that it's going to be a little bit of a tough spot for those who are maybe first diving into things. If you've never seen React before, you don't have to do a ton of React, but there's a little bit of a sort of a introduction to that can be a little bit weird, a little bit jarring. I have a personal vendetta against JSX, which happens to be the translation language that React uses for HTML, all because of everything that React gets translated into is just vanilla JavaScript. So You would have, if you had to write it without any sort of translation, in this case, something like Babel, you'd end up writing all these crazy, append DOM node sort of stuff. And that's just hardly readable and not very sustainable, especially if you have a team that's made up of varying different levels of skill sets. You'd like those folks to be comfortable that if they know HTML and SAS or CSS or what have you, that they can continue to do that. So that's a little bit of the makeup of what's been brought here. But before we get to it, a little bit of a teaser here. We are going to show some ways to build blocks where you don't even bother with React at all. So there's going to be some nice ways that folks can approach this sort of thing if they're really just sort of saying, hey, this is nice, but I don't want to, I want to stick with PHP for now. So part of the condition of Gutenberg as well, for those just aren't aware, and again, I think a number of you really are, is that there are, there's a condition to WordPress in the sense that it has this database structure that isn't super conducive, at least to the current, if you look at the legacy situation of how you pull your data back and how it shows up in their REST API, for example, where it separates out a few fields. It separates out the title, slug, things, author ID, things like that. But like the bulk of the content shows up as just one big chunk, right? And so what have block editors been doing all this time to make this work? Well, in some block editors like Elementor and I think Beaver Builder and a few others, they've just been using shortcodes. So if you had Beaver Builder or one of those on and you turn them off, all of a sudden, all your content would just be completely surrounded by just these never-ending nested brackets. WordPress does something a little bit more graceful, which is that it basically uses HTML comments, as you can kind of see on the slide here, to effectively outline where each container, each block is, and it just saves that as one big chunk. So if you were to do a REST API call or just database call back for the content field, for those that are familiar with that, you would just get back all the HTML, but you'd see a whole bunch of different HTML comments sort of wrapping each area. And what happens is every time you go to open up a page in the editor, Gutenberg, aka the React application built into WordPress now, is just parsing all of that markup and parsing those comments and say, oh, I see. He's got a heading block right here. I'm going to make sure it's wrapped in that container and uses those elements. And then every time you save it, it goes back to being just, sort of stringified all in the one big output of the content. So we'll kind of show how that gets affected as you build blocks, but that's kind of a nice thing to just be aware of as well, in case you're wondering why some of this stuff is maybe a little more structured in the database. Who uses Gutenberg now anyway? So I know that, we're using it in CALs. We've made it more of the dominant editor now for our current theme, as well as the new themes we're sort of moving people to. I know the school businesses is using it at this point. Libraries are using it with a more of a Rails front end, but use Gutenberg within WordPress as their content source for all of the folks that are doing content management there. I know extension folks are doing it, and I'm sure there may be more. It's really an interesting aspect to see where other people are going with Gutenberg. And I think, to me, what's really important about this and to consider is that, right now, if you have, let's say, a bunch of different groups all on different block editors, there's not really any way to sort of, those sites as they move from place to place, if they ever needed to, if some place, especially with extension, I think of this a lot because CALs and extension have a sort of a close relationship and things of that nature, that we would say that some sites might need to move from CALs to extension or vice versa. It is kind of a painful process sometimes because, we kind of have to say, hey, you either have to redo your content, you have to re-architect this, which is sometimes a good thing. Sometimes they need to redo their site. But sometimes that's just a lot of extra work. And it'd be nice if, for example, their site can sort of just come over as is, and then they can continue to work on it. One of the nice things about Gutenberg is that, at least in some of these spaces where we're starting to use the same sort of if you think of the two-dimensional layout engine of having, this sort of placement of content is one thing, and then the content modules themselves is another. If sort of the placement engine is sort of the same across a bunch of different areas, it becomes a lot easier to move things, partly because of the way Gutenberg also saves things. So for example, had a Gutenberg site, or a site that used Gutenberg for its editor, and we had made a bunch of content, and we picked up that site, we brought it over to some other place that at least is running the same version of WordPress, the site would still display, even though they may or may not have all the exact same blocks installed that we do. They would still at least display. They just wouldn't be able to edit those blocks that are custom there. Now, if a site's using mostly normal built into WordPress core blocks, then all those blocks are immediately editable right away. And to kind of answer to kind of bring the full compatibility around, what we're doing in CALS right now is we're building all of our blocks into a plugin. So for whatever reason, that group would like to continue letting that unit, whatever doing with their site, have that same block that they've had from CALS. If they're willing to run the CALS plugin, they can just activate that, and there you go. They now have those blocks. What I really like too is that it means that there's more shareability too, because I know that a lot of us have, various things we have to focus on. I know, for example, that, right now, like we'd like to lean people towards using Today.with.edu and other things that are campus resources. And if some of those became universal blocks built by the people that maintain those tools, that becomes really appealing, because we can have a whole layout that we've built in CALS and still just drop in a block, kind of like you would have a shortcode in the past, directly into the site. And there's not a lot of work to do with it. It's kind of like giving a shortcode with a nice GUI. So what are the pros and cons of this sort of thing, right? I mean, when you think about all of this, it's, flexible, it's modular. Blocks from different sources can be mixed and matched. As I just sort of mentioned, you have the right types of blocks you can create in almost any layout. There are some limitations here and there depending how fancy you're getting, but it is pretty darn flexible. Avoids content lock-in for the most part, right? Kind of talking about how, like, if you had something in Elementor and you suddenly turned off Elementor, your content sort of stuck there, or at least you have to rewrite it in some degree. And one nice thing is that, especially if you have your content creators wanting to do more, it does place more power of layout in the hands of your content creators. Now, what's the negative, right? I mean, it may be the same thing, right? Kind of placing some of the more of the power in the hands of the content creators. Sometimes you can see people getting into trouble, this sort of thing, but that maybe depends a little bit more on user education and learning to see if your users are trustworthy in this sort of tool, and seeing what your audience is there. But there's other things to keep in mind too. The block editor has a higher barrier to entry a little bit, I'd say, especially if you're used to just a normal old text area. Suddenly being thrown into Gutenberg can be really, really jarring or really daunting. The drag and drop interface has gotten better over time since its initial release, but it still has some little issues here and there, some things that kind of a little odd, sort of drag and drop stuff. I've seen in the latest WordPress 6 that they're kind of making some more improvements there, but again, I think there's still plenty of work to do. And I think WordPress is, the folks that work on WordPress have also admitted they're still working on those components. And then creating your own blocks, it's just not always super straightforward. That being said, I think thankfully with some things, the tools I'll show you today, it's not too bad. You can kind of get into it, and there's a number of things you can do. So building a block, right? There's a number of ways you can go about it. And there's a couple of four kind of main things I want to kind of focus on today and show you. Number one is just maybe trying to make your own React native block. That's just basically going to have its own little Webpack config, and it's going to do its thing to let you write normal-ish HTML, aka JSX, and then also have that just be made as a plugin for your site, and you can use it as you need to with among all the other normal core stuff. I'm going to go over a little bit of a brief review of what it's like to maybe make them with ACF. So for those that are familiar with advanced custom fields, very popular plugin, I actually just recently bought by WB Engine, is basically another really great way to make blocks. And that gives you a big leg up, especially if you're coming from a space where maybe some of these things you've already written in the past in just PHP. You can kind of pick up your exact PHP you've already written and just use it again. And then the last two things sort of augment on all of these, which is style variants and patterns. So without further ado, I'm going to jump into a couple of the technical bits here. I don't have my chat open, so please let me know if there's any questions that pop up, Mandy. I'm happy to sort of drop in and take a couple of questions if need be, but otherwise I'll keep going for now.
Sounds good.
Sorry.
That sounds good.
Okay, sounds good. I'm talking fast here. I know. So anyway, so React structure looks a little bit like this. So, and this is going to be somewhat similar to what we'll show in a moment, but your typical block, when you have it, you have a way to declare the register, you're registering the block itself. You're going to go through and, sort of including some styles for it, if you will. There's definitely attributes to your block in terms of what it looks like in the editor, meaning does it have a particular icon? Does it fall in certain categories? Do you have certain keywords a person can search for it by? And what are the actual functions for edit and save? Edit and save, we can kind of go over here in a moment, but basically those are effectively ways to both affect what the editing experience is like and what it officially actually saves as its HTML to the database when it actually goes off to be saved and then be viewable on the front end. So with that, I'm going to jump around here and do a little bit of showing a VS Code so we can talk about a couple of these things. First things first, a little bit of the React JS-based block here. So what I've done, and this is going to be when I'm going to showcase a couple of quick pieces here. Oops, I realize I have to undo full screen. So hopefully you can see it okay. For those that have, I'm assuming you've seen the Gutenberg editor itself, but this is roughly what it looks like here. You've got your title areas you did before. And then within, obviously, the editing space, you have all of these. It starts with almost like a paragraph block, and you can just start typing kind of like you would before, hit enter, keep typing, hit enter, keep typing. But you notice that everything kind of got chunked up here, and it's because that each one has become a block. In this case, you can see them as paragraph blocks.
We can't see that for some reason.
Oh, really? Is it showing?
It's just showing you no screen.
No, it's not showing my desktop again. Okay, let me reshare it. Sorry. Let me fix that. Good call. All right, let me try it again. I think it must have unshared when I closed that. How about now?
Now we can see it.
Excellent. All right, good to know. So yeah, in this case, you've got your basic editor here, and there's nothing too much to it. But the user gets, of course, this little panel that they can either pull up on the side here, or they can use a little bit in line as well. And that lets them see all these different blocks. And the blocks are really kind of the primary component to what someone's going to use to build up a page. So they can build a linear page of text still. And I believe you me, I've seen plenty of users that still do that because it's sort of what they might default to, or what they might start with. But there's a lot in here for blocks. And for those who haven't explored it yet, there's so many things you could potentially do when looking even at just the things that come with WordPress. So you're going to get things that cover the basics, like doing paragraphs and doing headings, lists, quotes, blocks, pre-formatted blocks of text, things like that, tables, media, that sort of thing. There's a lot in here. Obviously, the classic things that it used to support, right? Like galleries. All of that being said, these are blocks that come with WordPress, and you don't really have a good way to manipulate them completely, right? You're not going to be able to change all the markup without really going to edit core, which is a bad idea. Don't do that. But if you want to actually do some things with it, I'm going to give you some demos on how to. But what if we want to make our own block entirely, right? So my recommendation, especially for someone that's going to do this with the ReactJS sort of native way, is to leverage one of two current projects that are going on. Now, the one that I've been using for some time, because it's been going around for a while, is called Create Gutenberg. Now, this project is sort of just a nice sort of CLI that you spin up that helps manage its configuration in Webpack for handling that Babel translate stuff, the ESLinting you might want. This is something that if you dealt with, JavaScript frameworks before, it's kind of be somewhat familiar. If you haven't before, this is going to be maybe a little bit on the scarier side. But it's thankfully not too hard to spin up. So these days, if you have Node installed in your machine, all you have to do is run this little command, which is going to help you spin this up. I've done this in advance because I can tell you running something like Create Gutenberg, it takes a couple of minutes for it to really pull everything down. And since we're so short on time, I want to kind of keep things moving. But I can show you what that output would look like, right? So if I actually went to and actually did that command of Create Gutenberg, what you end up with is something like this my blocks list here. And I'm going to open this up in VS Code so you can see it. And what you really get is actually kind of basic, right? You kind of get your starting commands here, where you could actually go in and start up everything to get kind of started on your development. And just running something like npm run start isn't going to spin up a local web server, but it's just going to make sure it tackles, as you edit these blocks themselves, that it does compile them down and put them into dist for you so that they're ready to be queued and used on your site. Another nice thing about Create Gutenberg is that it also automatically assumes that you want to make this as a plugin. So it actually will create the plugin.php file for you and declare it. And obviously you should feel free to go in here and adjust this further, but that's kind of a nicety. So if you actually run this project in your plugins directory for maybe in your local environment, it's already going to make for you that plugin that's sort of ready to go there. The other project, by the way, and I do recommend taking a look at this one, is that WordPress finally put out their own. So this one's the more official one. I would actually look at this one more long-term. It does the exact same thing. I just don't have it fully spun up here to kind of show the demo here, but it effectively creates for you kind of the same output. So you end up with all of these sort of source folders that are going to create your block. I mean, it's almost verbatim the same. You can tell there's a lot of sort of inspiration from one to the other. This other first one's more of the community one that started up earlier, but the structure and the file format, everything is entirely the same. All right. So when you get into it, when you make a block, your block is going to basically consist of some of these basic elements. We're going to include some CSS because we want to be able to style things. Part of the sort of methodology or thought behind Gutenberg is that things, for the most part, look the same in the editor as they would on the front end. And now that's not necessarily universally true. You can do for every block, but for a lot of them you can. And that means that then your user gets a much more informed idea of what their page is going to look like before they hit publish, which is really, really helpful. As you go through and actually look through your actual block here, the two that it includes, just for your information, is that it creates an editor one and a style one. And the default behavior for this is that the editor styles are unique to when they're in the editor, and the style editors, it's going to throw you a little bit, are included in both the editor and the front end. So the idea is that if you can do everything on both sides the same, just put it in style.css. If you do need to do some unique stuff, put it in editor. That's sort of the general best practice there. Other things you get into is you see the register function here. You're going to have some things that just, talk about attributes. So you can change the icon, change what keywords it can be searched for by in the little Gutenberg search field in the upper left. And you have your edit function that you see right away here. Now, the edit function, kind of as it sounds, is the one that the editor is going to load when it recognizes the block so that it can be edited and adjusted. So unlike this default block, which it gives you, which is kind of static, this would be the place that you would include some of those input fields or date pickers or select boxes, things that you need to kind of take in the input from the user. And then likewise, the save function is going to similarly take the same thing and output it. So things where it's not whereas this one's again static to this one, so it looks very much the same. This is where you would take that same, you would take the output of whatever they were putting in. So I've got some examples of that for those that would like to see that, and we can kind of get into that a little bit. But just by including this and making sure that you've been running this, if you make any changes, your block is going to automatically show up within WordPress itself. So going in here, I think it made it, my blocks.cgb block. So it made this block for us. It's already here. It has both its edit and save markup, which is roughly the same. But for this demo, we'll see that it actually did a little adjustment so that the front end gets orange and the back end gets green. So you get a little bit of an idea of where things are going with it, right? The good news is that kind of once you get the hang of some of these elements to how you would make, how you make things edit in an editable fashion, how you make them save, and how you can maybe include extra attributes, which I'll show in a moment. This is really not too bad, really. And there's an interesting element to this that I think is also important, which is that what you do within Gutenberg, as you've maybe seen before, and I'll show this very briefly here, is that things can be nested, right? So if you have used Gutenberg before and you've used something like the columns block, great example. So columns, I'm going to decide a column structure. And let's say I like this block, but I really want to be in here, right? This is great. So I've got this in here. And on the right, I'm going to put the heading block. And I'm going to say test. This is, you notice I could put this in here. And right now, this lets me put anything else in here. Believe it or not, when you make your own blocks, you can dictate whether or not something can be included or not included. So let me give you an example of that. So I've got this block that I made called carousel group. Okay. Carousel group is just designed to make a carousel on the home page, or make a carousel on the page. And I thought, well, right now, WordPress already ships out of the box with something called the cover block, which is a block that it looks like a nice big image and lets you put things on top of like text. What if I could just make something that wraps that in something that I could then apply extra attributes to, right? That's all I'm doing here. So I've registered a block. I've called it block carousel group. I've given it some attributes, the title, some keywords. I've also given it a couple of different things that it supports, like whether it's just a normal centered element, whether it can be made into a wide view or a full view. I've also included some elements to let it toggle things like auto rotate time if I wanted to. And then down here in the edit function, what I'm doing here is I'm including a couple of inspector controls to allow the user to actually change things. Now, for those who've seen React stuff, this is going to be very familiar. To others, this may be a little bit out of left field. But again, I can assure you that once you get a chance to really sort of do this for a little while, you start to pick up on the different elements of it, and you have enough examples where it becomes kind of pretty quick and easy to make new blocks. So I have some select options here and what have you. And down here, I've got inner blocks, allowed blocks, and I've got an array. And all I'm passing is core cover. I could have multiple things. I could say you could do core cover and headings, or core cover and maybe media, whatever. I can decide what goes in here. So suddenly, if I'm only allowing this set of blocks, I can be aware of what the user is going to dump in here. And that helps me a lot in what I make sure I do with it. So what does this look like when I put it out here? If I come out here and I say, let's go ahead and do that carousel, I can only add into the carousel the cover block. And since it's the only one, it also just adds it by default rather than making me sort of bring up a drop down and pick it. And if I set something in here, let's say like a nice image, and I can do anything on top of it if I wanted to, instead of like some text. And if, you can obviously take advantage of the existing block. So I didn't have to create the cover block. The cover block came with WordPress. I get to take advantage of it that it's there, which is really, really nice. I can sit there and duplicate it. And I'm going to do it. I'm going to make 3 of them here. And if I actually look at my carousel, I also have these elements I created up here, this reduce animation flag, whether I want it to auto rotate, things like that. And basically, by not doing a whole lot of work on my block end code, just by saying, hey, you're allowed to use the cover block in here, I could then use enough CSS and JavaScript on the front end to make a nice carousel, right? So now I have this carousel, and that's kind of cool, right? I didn't have to do a ton of work to make that happen because the cover block is by default there. And as the cover block gets improved, because it's a core block, I get sort of to reap the benefits of that automatically. There's some other cool things too. Obviously, I mentioned, you saw in those attributes, I gave it an opportunity to be wide or full. I can do that. I can say full, and then come back here and view the page. And there it is, full screen. So that was the React-based block. Let's quickly jump to the PHP one, because I know we're already starting to run out of time. What we have here in the same example, same exact situation here, is that we'd like to include something that maybe we've already built before, right? How we do that is really simple. So all we had to do was we need to still register a block. Now, Advanced Custom Fields has some fantastic documentation. Please take a look at it. And you can see what you can do to register a block. They give you a good outline of the function. You're just declaring what it is. You're declaring which template file it's going to use, which PHP file. And this could be in your plugin or it could be in a theme, doesn't really matter. You include some of the same attributes about it that you would otherwise if you were doing it natively. And in this scenario, I'll show you what that looks like. That's the remote WordPress content block that was made here. All we have to do, I put it down here in, there we go, blocks, remote content block. This is the PHP, and it's the exact same thing I had written when I had done it just as a page template in my WordPress theme. I didn't have to change anything. I'm still using the same get field calls. I'm still using the same PHP code I was to determine what it was dumping out. And the way that comes out in actual Gutenberg at this point is you end up with another block that shows up here, remote content block, and it's automatically showing up the news.cal site because that's what I gave it as a placeholder. I can change the number of posts, and it even gives me a little live preview of what it's going to pull. And that's it, right? So that makes it incredibly simple to start using. And because I've got these mix of blocks, I can mix and match third-party blocks, first-party blocks, and that sort of thing. Now, I'm going to jump to this because I'm already running out of time. But one thing that's really interesting about this is that I mentioned how you cannot change first-party blocks, right? Those are coming from core, and you really shouldn't be editing core. You can wrap them in blocks that you've made, kind of like I did with carousel. You can also add things like style variants. So a style variant is something really, really simple, where if I'm going to sit here and add something, let's say like buttons, right? These buttons, I can decide if they're outline, if they're large, fill. These little selections on the right, these are style variants. I added these. These are not coming with WordPress, right? And the way you do that is remarkably simple. You're going to go into and actually decide under your blocks. See, I actually have the wrong one here. You can actually just basically declare, here we go, it's under system blocks or source blocks. You can just declare that you're going to register a block style for which block it's for, what's the name of it, and what's the class name, because all you're doing here is giving it a quick class selection. And then of course, the way that's going to look is just purely dependent on your CSS. As long as you put a class name or, you assign some styles to that class in your CSS for your theme or your plugin, that takes effect. So now you can start to style and give different option styles for this sort of thing. Last but not least, because we're getting down to the last minute here, is patterns. And patterns are incredibly powerful, right? So patterns, let's say you've got this fancy editor with all these different things and things you can nest and move around. And a lot of users we've seen have just an incredibly tough time with this sort of thing, right? There's a lot of things to learn. One of the things that we started to want to do is make it so you could just decide, just take a best recommendation from us, right? Say, I need to make an about page, and I'm really not sure to start with WordPress and start with Gutenberg, but I've maybe heard about patterns. Patterns are incredibly powerful, and patterns is something we've been starting to make as well. And when you make patterns, they're even simpler than style variants. I mean, we're going from the hardest thing down to the easiest thing. Style variants are something you can make almost in a split second. Give you an example of this. So here's this about page layout. I'm going to click this, and it's dumped in an entire layout into the page. It's already ready to go. And all I have to do is hit publish, and I could actually see it right off the bat. Here's my about page, and it's already ready to go. All I have to do is go in and make maybe some text tweaks so it doesn't say lorem ipsum. The way you do this, the way you make these for your users so that they're prescribed to them in your theme or in your plugin is really simple. Build them up in the editor themselves, just as you see here. Build them up in the GUI. You've built them, but you've been working on blocks. You're probably gonna be more familiar with it. All you have to do at that point, switch to the code view, as I did here with the ellipsis, grab everything in here, just do a full select all and copy. And then all you have to do is save it to your actual, save it out to your patterns list here. And just to give you an example, this is what it looks like. I've just dumped into this variable that entire string. Didn't have to worry about, escaping spaces, things, or escaping returns, things like that. And then below it, I register my block pattern. And that's it. That's what makes it show up within WordPress. And you can decide all the attributes that how they would find it, how they'd search for it, and that sort of thing. So this was a really, really fast speed run through a whole lot of things that you can do within Gutenberg. And there's a lot more things that you could be doing. There's things you can do within your theme support to lock down the color palette. So the user can't pick custom colors. They can only pick the color palette you prescribe. And and when you do it that way, they only show up with classes. So as a developer, you get control over how things work and when things show up. So I went through a whole bunch there. What thoughts, questions do you have before I know everyone has to run?
Yeah, so I'm just gonna note that it is 3:47, so there is another session that just started. So we did have a few people drop off, but it looks like there were two questions. One that was earlier, that's probably a pretty quick one for you to answer, from Dave, which says, for those who use Gutenberg now, do we know if it's being used only for public-facing sites, or are people using it for intranet sites also?
That's a good question. Most of the sites I know are externally facing. I know that right now we're going to be using it as we're rebuilding a administrative site for CALs. So that'll technically still be available externally, but is intended for an internal audience. I think there's not really anything that prohibits you from using it for internal audiences, if that helps.
Cool. And then the other question was from David Schultz. Those are some cool blocks. How can we share these throughout the university?
Oh, that's a really good one too. And I think of this in terms of like interop and other endeavors to like share sort of these sort of things. I would think that it would be really great to really collaborate more with each of the different development groups on campus and design groups on campus to see who's building them and figure out a good way to place them. I mean, if everyone's going to have them maybe in GitLab somewhere, having a good way to make sure that we know where to share these would be wonderful. And who knows, maybe someone's going to be able to take up the effort to build some sort of central listing of these sort of things. I think a repository is a good place for them to live in terms of something like Git, but how do people know where to find them, right? So that's a good question. That's something that I think we'd have to tackle still as a campus.
Absolutely. Awesome. Well, I think those were all the questions.
Yeah, thank you, everybody.
I am going to thank everyone for coming and hit the stop record button.